Hey everyone, so in today's video I'll be going over every LEGO Eeveelution MOC, and I'll be showing you guys a detailed look at each of them individually later on in this video. Like with all the other builds I've shared on this channel, I will have a link in the description below for both the parts file and instructions for all the models shown. The proceeds just to help support me and this channel, and I do not sell the physical models, so what you're paying for is only for the parts file and instructions. I'll get into the part counts for each of them throughout the video, but if you're to build all the models shown, the total part count is 1,546 pieces. At the time of recording this video, just the parts themselves are estimated to cost around $210 to $220 Canadian. This does not include shipping or handling, and your final cost may vary. I think you may be able to find some of the parts for cheaper, but it will really depend where you're located and how many Bricklink sellers are close to you. But you can also check the LEGO Pick-a-Brick site, since some of the pieces can be cheaper there than on Bricklink. So before we take a closer look at each one individually, you guys may notice that they all share some similar building techniques, especially for the head, torso, and legs. Due to the limited part selection for certain colors, I had to think of some workarounds to ensure I was able to keep a consistent look for all Eeveelutions. For the legs, I tried to keep the same shaping and length for each one, and they all have pretty much the same points of articulation, but the range of motion can vary slightly for some of them. For most of them, you're only able to rotate the hips, knees, and ankle joints on one axis, so the overall posability can be a bit limited here. As for the torso, they all have a common base design, and I think it's one of the most consistent sections in terms of shape and form between all Eeveelutions, aside from Eevee of course. Like the torso, the head also shares the same base design between the Eeveelutions, but with a bit more tweaks due to the different features each one has, which we'll get into more detail throughout this video. So to kick things off, we'll start by taking a closer look at Eevee. Eevee was actually the last one I designed in this line, since I wasn't sure how big I wanted to make it. I figured I would try to build the Eeveelutions first, since some of them would be pretty tricky to design in comparison, and this way I could get a better sense of how big I would need to make Eevee, so that its scale was in line with the others. I think the overall build for Eevee is pretty simple, but I actually changed the initial design from what I posted originally on my Instagram, since I thought the legs were a bit too long, making it stand a bit too tall. I ended up condensing and shortening the MOC a bit, and I have to say I'm much more satisfied with the updated build here. Despite its size, you can still pose it around, but the articulation is a bit more limited from my original design. You can rotate the ears around to give it some different expressions, move the tail up and down, and you can only rotate the hind legs forward and back. Due to the way it's built now, the front two legs are fixed at this angle. The rest of the head came together pretty smoothly, and is actually quite similar to my Pikachu MOC. The head is fixed so you can pose it around, and I used some arched bricks and notches in tan attached on its sides to resemble its thick fur around the neck. This is also how it looks compared to my Pikachu MOC, which I think scales pretty well in case you wanted to build both of these starters from the Let's Go games. Eevee uses a total of 71 pieces and can cost around $8 to $10 Canadian. So going in order of the Pokédex, next we'll take a closer look at Vaporeon. I think Vaporeon was one of the later ones from the line I designed, due to the limited part selection in its main colors. It mainly uses medium azure, with some accents of dark blue, tan, and white. For this design in particular, the legs were a bit tricky to build, since I wanted to try and keep its look consistent with the other Eeveelutions. I had to get a bit creative here with the part usage, but I think I was able to keep its overall look similar enough with the others. However, one of the main compromises was that the thighs are a bit bulky here in comparison. The tail was the next most challenging part of the design, since there isn't that many modified plates in medium azure, so I couldn't use a lot of my usual building techniques, meaning I had to improvise a bit here. I also needed to continue this dark blue line of scales from the body and actually tweak the final look of the tail a bit from my initial design. I originally had a 1x4 curved slope attached upside down at the midsection here to make the tail a bit more smooth at the bottom at first, but due to the way it was attached in Stereo, I found that the actual connection was stressing on some of the parts, making the 1x4 curved slope stick out a bit, so I ended up removing it entirely and just using some plates to taper into the end. It's a bit blocky in its look, but if LEGO ever releases some smaller inverted curved slopes in medium azure, I'll be sure to include them in the future. The articulation for the tail is pretty limited, and you can only really rotate it up and down from the base and at the tip as well. One of its main features that sticks out from the rest is its unique collar, which I tried to mimic with the use of this octagonal modified plate with bars on each side. Each frill is attached with clip plates and are angled up to help cover some of the gaps, and I think these half notch pieces help to resemble its official design. The entire head and collar are attached to the body with a pneumatic T-bar piece, so you can pose it around, but the range of motion is somewhat limited due to the way it's connected. For the head details, I actually forgot that it had a head fin at the top, so I had to add it in afterwards, but I'm happy I was able to include it with relatively common parts. The ears are brick built and are fixed to the head, and I think this is the only Eeveelution MOC where the ears aren't posable. The total part count for Vaporeon is 197 pieces and can cost around $20 to $25 Canadian. So next up is Jolteon, which I think was the third or fourth one that I designed out of this line. Since it mainly uses yellow with some white and black pieces, it was pretty easy to build due to the wide part selection in these colors. The main challenges for this build in particular were the spiky fur collar or mane around its neck and trying to capture the spiky fur all over its body. The first spikes mainly use a combination of wedges, wedge plates, and slopes attached to most of its sides, but to match it with the official design, I had to make sure that it tapered out at the rear as well. Jolteon is also one of the only ones out of this line that doesn't have a long or distinct tail, which made the design much easier and quicker as well. For the head, they're attached to the body using a hinge brick, so the articulation for that connection is a bit limited, but the head connects to the collar or mane with a pneumatic T-bar piece, so that just helps provide some flexibility for different poses. So you can rotate the entire head subassembly just up and down, but at this connection you can also rotate it and angle it up and down as well for some different looks. Unlike Vaporeon, you can pose around the ears, and that just helps you to get into some different looks and expressions. For the legs, as mentioned earlier, there's articulation at the ankles, knees, and hips. But for Jolteon's case here, the hips for the front are a bit limited due to the collar or mane, and they're much more limited for the hind legs due to these side spikes, but if you wanted to, you could rotate these side spikes out just to free up some space. Just have to be careful as the connection points for these joints are pretty fragile. Finally, the total part count for Jolteon is 181 pieces and costs around $15 to $20 Canadian. Third up is Flareon, and to be honest, I think in terms of the build, when I finally built this, I think it became my least favorite. This will probably be the first one I redesign if I revisit this in the future. When I was designing it digitally, I heavily leaned on using the red in LEGO for its main color since it probably was the closest match, but in the official artwork, it's more of a reddish orange or orange red, which unfortunately LEGO does not make. The silver lining was that red at least has a pretty wide part selection, so that made designing a bit easier. Looking at the torso and legs, I would say they're pretty standard for this compared to the others, while its large tail and furry collar or mane are probably the most interesting parts of the build. Out of the rest, Flareon stands at the tallest and uses the most parts, which I think is pretty fitting since if you look at the size comparisons, Flareon is clearly the biggest. I think to improve this MOC, its stance should be a bit wider and lower, with the collar or mane covering more of its upper body. Again, these would be details I would try to better capture if I redesign it. Taking a closer look at the tail, it's just built around some snot bricks for the interior, and I tried to use some different slopes and curved slopes to give her its fiery and furry look. All these slope pieces help to taper up to the tip to try and resemble its large flame appearance, and if you look at the left and right sides, they're actually the same build, as well as the top and bottom sides. The entire tail is attached with just a bar and clip plate, so you can only rotate it up and down. Like Jolteon, the head and mane are connected to the body with the hinge brick, so you're only able to rotate it up and down at that connection. But where the head connects to the mane, it uses a pneumatic T-bar piece, so you can also rotate it up and down and side to side slightly there. The range of motion is a bit more limited just due to the extra pieces used for the mane. The ears are the same build as Jolteon's, so there's a wide range of motion, and you can get into many different looks and expressions. Due to the way the mane's built, I do think it makes the head set up a bit too high, making it seem like the neck is elongated, so this is one of the main reasons why I wasn't too satisfied with the final build. The total part count for Flareon is 253 pieces, which is the most out of the entire line, and can cost around $20 to $25 Canadian. Now that the Gen 1 Kanto evolutions are done, we'll move on to the Gen 2 Johto ones, starting with Espeon. This was the second one I had designed, and it took much longer than I expected, since I was still trying to figure out how I wanted to build the body, so that it could be repeated for all other evolutions. It also didn't help that the medium lavender color I used here has probably the smallest part selection compared to all the other colors used. There are a few pieces here that are also quite uncommon, so just pay attention to them when you're buying your parts. The body and legs are pretty straightforward. Once I settled on a design and look I felt would transfer well with the other Eeveelutions, I actually changed the build of the tail to add some more points of articulation and to try to make it a bit more accurate as well. The tail now has 2 points of articulation. You can bend it at the tip and base, and you can even rotate it as well. Just be careful of the connection points there. The head was probably the trickiest part of the design, and it was mainly due to the build for the ears, since I wanted to capture its unique shaping, but it was quite challenging with the parts available. I used some dark blue modified plates and some half notches to capture the shaping for the inner part of the ears, and then used some medium lavender wedges, slopes, and inverted slopes to capture the rest of the shaping. Since they're connected with bars and clips, you can rotate them forward and back, but I usually keep them angled towards the back, and if you look at it from the top, the angle of the wedges lines up perfectly with the shield top on top. The rest of the head is pretty plain, and is attached to the Matic T-bar piece with a decent range of motion, at least more than the Kanto Eeveelutions have. One thing I do think would be better captured as a print or sticker would be its gem on its forehead, since right now it sits a bit too low, but it was a compromise I had to make, since if it was placed where this 1x2 slope piece was, it ended up making the head look a bit too flat, or like it was indented at the skull. The total pro count for Espeon is 169 pieces, nice, and can cost around $25 to $30 Canadian. This is a bit higher than the others so far, but it's mainly due to some of the rare parts that had to be used here. Next up is Umbreon, and this was actually the first one I designed out of this entire evolution line, since I thought it would be one of the trickiest to build. However, since its main color is black with some yellow accents, these are two of the most common part colors in LEGO, so I knew I'd have more room to experiment and come up with a design that could help me with the others later on. The legs here use a very different building technique compared to the rest, which is due to the way I built its iconic yellow rings using 2 yellow 1x1 bracket pieces. With brackets, they have a half plate thickness for the vertical portion, so playing with that subtle geometry, I figured you could sort of get an approximation of a ring, but Legoified, and actually quite like how it turned out. It's not perfectly round, but again this is LEGO, so I think the blockiness of it adds to its charm, but obviously a custom print or sticker will be much more accurate here. Looking at the tail, it's pretty simple in its build, and I do wish that it was a bit more round overall. I did consider using some round bricks and plates at first to capture the ring detail around its tail, but the round pieces made the tail look a bit too skinny, and if I wanted to add the small tip at the end, the corners from the slopes and curved slopes jutted out and made that transition a bit too awkward. Looking at the entire tail, it's attached with the clip and bar pieces, so you can only really rotate it up and down. The head is also pretty simple in its build, but this was the starting design that I used for all the other evolutions, so trying to nail down the look and proportions that would be repeated did take some trial and error. Again, this has the same issue as the gem on Espeon, as its center ring should be higher, and I opted to use this minifigure ring piece here since I thought it matched the overall shape and proportions a bit better. Alternatively, you could use a yellow hollow stud instead, which would match in color, but I felt like the hole was a bit too small. Ears are connected with black tab pieces, so you can pose them in many different angles, and the entire head is attached with a Matic T-bar piece with a pretty wide range of motion. All these together just help to give some different looks and expressions. The total pro count for Umbreon is 157 pieces, and it can cost around $15 to $20 Canadian. We're almost done, but now we're at the Gen 4 Sinnoh Eeveelutions, and we'll take a closer look at Leafeon first. In terms of the design, Leafeon was pretty smooth and just needed some color swaps and tweaks from the base design that I created. I think I finished it shortly after I finished the Kanto Eeveelutions, since it borrows many of the same building techniques. It's mainly built using 10 pieces, which has a fairly wide part selection in LEGO, but there are a few uncommon parts here, so that may drive up the final cost a bit. I think the only sections that pose a bit of a challenge here were the tail and head. For the tail, I really wanted it to resemble the rustled leaf look it has in the official design, so I tried to use different slopes and inverted slopes, which I think does an okay job at capturing the overall shaping at least. I would like to maybe add some more dimension or texture onto the sides, since how it looks now, it can be a bit flat. The entire tail is attached to the body with some clip and bar pieces, so you can only rotate it up and down. The other challenge was capturing the leaf it has on its head, and I did play with some other plant pieces at first, but none of them captured the look I wanted, so I decided to brick build it instead. It's a pretty simple build here, and is attached to the head using an angled bar with a stud piece in green onto a clip plate, which lets me have it a bit off center and angled slightly as well. Like the others, the head is attached to the Matic T-bar piece again, but due to the green horn or spike it has near the back of the neck or nape, the range of motion is pretty limited compared to the rest. The ears are also the same design as my Jolteon and Flareon MOCs, with the same range of motion as well. The total part count for Leafeon is 153 pieces, and it's one of the more expensive ones as it can cost around $30 to $35 Canadian. I do recommend sourcing some of the parts here from the LEGO Pick-a-Brick site, which I think will help cut down on the overall cost. Next, we'll take a closer look at Glaceon. Glaceon was one of the more complicated evolutions to design due to its unique and subtle color difference. In most of the references I used, Glaceon had a slightly lighter shade of blue when compared to Vaporeon, so I wanted to make sure I used a different color in LEGO as well. I ended up using the bright light blue here with the dark teal for its accent color, which I think was the closest match to its official design. One of the compromises I made was that for the hair details, the bangs and strands are supposed to be a lighter shade of blue, but darker than the body. I would have liked to use the dark azure here, but sadly the 1x2 half notch pieces I want to use are very rare in this color, so I just opted to use the dark teal for the entire hair detail. I think the dark azure notches only come in one or two pretty expensive sets, so if LEGO ever releases them in more sets in the future, I'll be sure to use them. Even though the bright light blue isn't too common, it has many useful pieces that I frequently use, so the rest of the build came together fairly smoothly. This is one of the only evolutions where I had to use a different technique for the shins to try and keep the dark teal for its feet consistent with the official design. Because of the parts used, the feet and ankles here have a bit more articulation than the others, so you can bend and rotate them, whereas the others you can only bend them up and down. Looking at the tail, I had to make another compromise in the design due to the parts available, since I wish I was able to have it taper and become more narrow at the base. I figured to have the tail be a bit wider in order to keep the diamond shape at the end in the dark teal color, which was already quite challenging to capture. The entire tail is attached to the body with clip and bar plates, so you can only rotate it up and down, just like some of the other Eeveelution MOCs. The ears were also a bit tricky to capture due to the limited parts, but I tried to base it off the ears from my Leafeon, Jolteon, and Flareon designs with some tweaks. The ears and hair strands are connected onto a single stud, so you can only rotate them on one axis, and unfortunately, the hair strands do tend to block the eyes in many of the angles. The head is connected in the same way with the pneumatic T-bar piece, so altogether you can still get some different expressions and poses out of it. The total part count for Glaceon is 191 pieces, and it can cost around $20 to $25 Canadian. Like Leafeon, a lot of the pieces used may be more readily available from the LEGO Pick-a-Brick site, and I have seen some of these pieces sell for very high in Bricklink for some reason, so just pay attention to the prices when you're buying them. Finally, last but not least, we'll take a closer look at the Gen 6 Kalos Eeveelution Sylveon. Sylveon was one of the last ones in the line that I designed, which was intentional since it seemed like it had the most complex features out of all the others. I wanted to save this one for last, so that I could have some time to work through the other designs first, which would hopefully give me some ideas on how to tackle Sylveon's design in LEGO. Even though the majority of the body is white, I need to include some bright pink, which you would think would have a decent part selection in LEGO, but it's actually pretty limited or has some pretty rare parts to it. One example is that if you look at the shins, this is the only evolution where they are built upside down, since the regular 1x2 curve slope piece that I use in almost all my other builds only came in bright pink in one Overwatch set back in 2019. It reappeared this year in a couple of other 2023 sets, but it's still not widely used, so the price can be a bit high. Its more common counterpart, which is the same curved slope piece but inverted, comes in many sets, so that's why the back of the shins have some exposed studs, and I decided not to tile it off since the extra tile on my shins look a bit too bulky. Taking a closer look at the front, the bow detail on the chest uses the exact same build as the one on its left ear, and I really wanted to build it around this 1x1 heart-shaped tile. I'm still surprised how nicely the entire bow came together with just a few pieces too. The ribbons attach to the front, and each section uses some bar and clip plates, so you can rotate and angle each of the sections around, just to change up the look a bit. And I think this also helps to add some movement into the ribbons, just to make it look more flowy and light. For the tail, I decided to keep it pretty simple, just like its official design, so it's only built with a handful of pieces. It's connected to the body with a single stud, so you're only able to rotate it side to side. For the head, it follows the same base design, but the ears were the more challenging part here, since one of the ribbons from the left ear is supposed to wrap around the head and connect to the right one. This one detail probably took the longest time for me to design, since trying to keep it thin and having it look like it's flowy is already hard enough to capture in LEGO. I had to have some creative liberties here, so if you look at the back of the head, these white cheese slopes and 1x2 plate and ingot pieces are supposed to represent the ribbon flowing from the left ear onto the back of the head and then towards the right ear. Then if you come around to the right ear, this 1x1 bracket and curved slope are supposed to give the impression that the ribbon is continuing around and flowing upward along with the right ear. I won't blame you guys if it's a bit hard to imagine, but I figured it was a close enough approximation for the idea I want to get across. Each of the ears are attached to the head with a modified towel and vertical bar piece, so you're only able to rotate them on one axis, which does limit its posability compared to the others. The head is connected to the body with a white pneumatic T-bar piece, so you can rotate it left to right and angle it up and down with a decent range of motion like the others. The total part count for Sylveon is 174 pieces, and it can cost around $25 to $30 Canadian, which makes it one of the more pricier Eeveelution MOCs. Finally, for a sense of scale, this is how they all look compared to a minifigure. And as an added bonus, this is how Eevee looks next to all the other Kanto starters. For the instructions and parts files, I've released a mega bundle of the entire line on my store, as well as each of them individually, just in case you wanted to build specific ones. I've also released some sub-bundles for each generation or region, and an updated Kanto starter pack which will now include both Pikachu and Eevee as well. I think in terms of my favorites out of this line, mainly considering just the builds themselves and not the lore or stats from the games, I think my top 3 would be Umbreon, Leafeon, and Sylveon, since they all had unique challenges in their designs, and I just really like how they all came together. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this video. I know it was quite long, but let me know down in the comments below which ones are your favorite, as well as your thoughts and any suggestions for my next build. If you stayed this long, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.